Thank you for joining us for Bright Spark in Freedom's Pursuit, the men, women, and children of Hyde Park's New Guinea community before the Civil War. I'm Bill Jeffway, the Executive Director of the Dutchess County Historical Society. There are many people I'd like to thank for their help in this project, which I'll do at the end. I'll also show you where you can find further information and tools to do your own research on this topic. This project is just one in a long series of investigations that I hope will inspire future study. I often say that historical investigations do not provide answers but better questions, and I definitely found that to be the case here. I will be referencing 4 major prior historical investigations that I'd like to recognize. The earliest is a set of late 19th century diaries kept by the local historian Edward Brayman. They're part of the FDR Hudson Valley and Dutchess County manuscripts collection at FDR Library. Next is the publication of an article in the 1939 Dutchess County Historical Society yearbook, written by a local historian at that time, Henry Hackett, who came to own the central portion of New Guinea. Next, in partnership and under the leadership of the Dutchess County Black History Committee, Bard Archaeology conducted a significant archaeological investigation along the central lane of the community, Fredonia Lane. And created most recently, I draw on the successful 2018 application to the U.S. Department of Interior National Register of Historic Places for the New Guinea Community Site. I want to thank Dutchess County government, specifically County Executive Mark Molinaro, County Clerk Brad Kendall, and County Historian Will Tatum for being February sponsors of our virtual event space and its programs, like the live and archived version of this program. Such support allows us to develop programs and make them available at no cost to viewers. You'll find I rely frequently on publicly accessible county resources, like the Ancient Documents Online Archives and the Online Historic Resources Survey, among others. Over the next 45 minutes, I want to introduce you to the people who formed a temporary community of around 120-150 people across 2 generations in today's Hyde Park, and the people and influences that either put up barriers or help facilitate their path to freedom and equality. Within 1 square mile, along and around the Crum Elbow Creek, the majority were persons of color. That's why it earned the name of the West African country of Guinea, but it is a superficial, generic reference. A bright spark fades, but while present can be hot and piercing and consequential. Such was the case with the New Guinea community. The stories of Richard Jenkins, Betty Prime, Griffin, Diana Anthony, Pompey Brown, and others often overlooked can inspire us to see many of the things we might take for granted, and informs us on the dynamics of creating sustainable, positive change. In addition to bringing creativity and value to the county's dynamic field of agriculture and related industries like its mills, rivers, and land transportation, the people of New Guinea took deadly risks, like escaping from enslavement in Brazil on a boat under a pile of fruit, or growing old in a cave-like lean-to so they could live to see the day that they could march and sing in a parade in Poughkeepsie to celebrate a constitutional amendment guaranteeing their right to vote regardless of race. Dutchess County is a strategic point on the mighty Hudson River between New York City and Albany in routes west, around which New York built its empire economy. Given our settlement history, it's appropriate that Crum Elbow is a mashup of Dutch and English words referring to a crooked elbow. Indigenous peoples lived here thousands of years before the 1609 arrival of Henry Hudson on behalf of the Dutch. Settlement first occurred at the 2 points just mentioned, so settlement of Dutchess County came later. But slavery was with us from the beginning. A 1714 census shows 449 persons living in Dutchess County, 29 of them enslaved. New York was a big slave state. Enslavement came with a settlement of Dutch, English, German, and French Huguenot settlers who settled from the northwest and south. Between 1790 and 1820, with a countywide population of persons of color just over 2,000, The degree of enslavement went from 80% to 30% until it was finally abolished statewide in 1827. Take a look at the dramatic change in the free black population in Hyde Park. In just 2 decades between 1810 and 1830, the free black population grew by a factor of 5. This is from federal census numbers, and I'm quite sure there was an undercounting, because a great number seem to have settled in the most rudimentary and precarious of homes and huts along this area of Crumelbo Creek. Given their impact and influence on the New Guinea community, I'd like to introduce the great estate owners, starting with the site of today's Vanderbilt estate due west of New Guinea. In the period before the abolition of slavery in New York, there were 3 generations of bards living there: John, Samuel, and William. John and Samuel Bard were both highly regarded physicians. John was a friend of Benjamin Franklin, and Samuel was the personal physician to George Washington. William became a businessman. The subsequent owner was another famous physician, a protege and student of the Bards, David Hosack, who was famous for creating the nation's first botanical garden in New York City, and for being the physician who tended to the dying Alexander Hamilton after that fateful duel. We're not sure where Hunting Sherrill lived precisely, but he married into the wealthy Mulford family and had significant landholdings all across Hyde Park and across the New Guinea community, as you will see. In the estate lot just north of the Bard and Hosack estate was the estate of Nathaniel Pendleton and his son Edmund, called Placentia. They were succeeded by James K. Paulding. Nathaniel Pendleton is best known for being Alexander Hamilton's chosen second in that fatal duel. We can be certain in saying that the most outspoken, pro-slavery advocate of all of them was Paulding, who published aggressive pro-slavery views in 1836, which will be included in the resources I point out at the end of the program. By 1850, we find that the black servants of Paulding's Hyde Park estate have been completely replaced with Irish servants. By contrast to these loud and commercially ambitious estate owners, the Quakers arrived discreetly, entering from the southeast. They lived a quieter, inward-looking life, seeking their inner light in meeting houses where silence prevailed, their principal dedication to avoiding war and oaths, to calling for the abolition of slavery, and the equal participation of women and women's suffrage made them radicals. They ended up creating the largest population of Quakers in the country outside of Philadelphia, producing from its schools individuals like the abolitionist and women's suffrage leader Lucretia Mott. The difference west and east can be seen in this 1790 census record. If you look at the Quaker stronghold of Paulding, you can see that although the population of persons of color is small, the majority there are free. In the immediate area around Hyde Park at that time, only 1 in 9 persons of color was free. This is the 1764 oblong meeting house in Paulding, where a vote took place in 1767 that called for Quakers to not only be banned from purchasing enslaved persons, but to ban all slave ownership, affecting national change within their community and becoming national and international voices for abolition. And yet, the need for the protection that a community like New Guinea could afford can be seen even in this seemingly safe place. 2 years after the vote, it was determined that a member of that meeting had sold a free black man into slavery. He was banished from the Quaker faith. Given Dutchess County's strategic location on the Hudson River and its large Quaker population, many people ask about the Underground Railroad. New Guinea's location meant that it was close to both the ground-based inland route among Quakers and the river route. The downside of the land route was that it took longer and afforded more opportunities to be discovered. The river route is hard to track because of the involvement of a changing and varied network of black workers in boats, hotels like the Exchange Hotel shown here at the foot of Main Street, Poughkeepsie, and in transportation. The names shown are from an 1840 census taker's notebook, from our collections, showing the number of persons of color who worked in different roles at this transportation hub. We know of at least 2 freedom seekers who ended up going no further north than New Guinea, making it their permanent home, which has to be a reflection on the relative safety of the predominantly black, closely knit community. I'm sure there were more freedom seekers than those just 2, but again, these things are very hard to firmly confirm. At a state level, while New York abolished slavery in 1827, in addition to setbacks like the 1850 Fugitive Slave Law at a national level that virtually required persons of so-called free states like New York to turn in freedom seekers to federal authorities, New York State created its own barriers to freedom and equality. At the 1841 New York State Constitutional Convention, under the leadership of Columbia County's Martin Van Buren, the man who shortly would become President of the United States, there instituted a requirement that applied only to persons of color and not to whites. The requirement was that any person of color who wanted to vote had to own at least $250 in property, free and clear of any mortgage or loan. So land ownership, such as was being offered in New Guinea, could offer significant benefits that were unfortunately necessary. On a national level, it was all about the Constitution, the July 4, 1776 Declaration of Independence, and its stated principle that all persons are created equal rang hollow to some, as Frederick Douglass famously articulated in his speech about the meaning of the 4th of July to a black person. If there is an endpoint, at least for our purposes here and relative to the New Guinea community and its emergence and fading away, it's the 1870 15th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, promising that voting rights of persons of color will not be denied or abridged. Solomon Garnett, one of New Guinea's residents, who was a fugitive slave from Virginia, who took up residence in the 1830s, took what would have been an unusual trip to Poughkeepsie on May 18, 1870. There he joined thousands in celebrating the landmark in gatherings that included a parade and fireworks and concerts. This is the scene of such celebrations in Washington, D.C. The 15th Amendment was the third of 3 consecutive amendments that respectively abolished slavery, guaranteed equal protection under the law regardless of race, and promised that voting rights for persons of color would not be abridged or denied. Despite his age, his white hair, and poor health, Solomon Garnett is reported to have been an active participant in activities. What I think we can learn from the people of New Guinea is their ingenuity, creative and persistence, and sacrifice that they made both as individuals and collectively, with an eye on the right prize, with an eye on fundamental legal change, which afforded material, economic advancement, such as land ownership. Their goal was to firmly establish the promise of freedom and equality. Whether the promise was fulfilled then or is fulfilled now is another matter. But the job at the time was to establish the promise, and that was achieved. Now let's look at New Guinea. New Guinea is loosely organized around 2 main roads. The older and more substantial is the road oriented east and west, shown here, known today as Mill Road. The mill was located where the road ends on the eastern end, as it reaches the Crum Elbow Creek. The remains of the mill are easily seen today. If you follow that road west, you're taken to a major landing, so this road would have been heavily traveled and important economically as it connected to the Hudson River. We're not exactly sure when Fredonia Lane was created. It retains that name today as a walkable lane in a public space in the town of Hyde Park, allowing us to literally walk in the footsteps of the people we're coming to know. Older records describe it as flanked by stone walls. The choice of name is likely to have been influenced by a close friend and colleague of the Bards. Samuel Mitchell was a U.S. senator who promoted the words Fredonia and Fredonians rather than America and Americans, which was becoming popular at the time. Despite lobbying President Jefferson, Noah Webster, and others, it did not take on nationally, but it did stick here. This is a view looking south from the north entrance to the lane from Mill Road. It's accessible as a walk, but surrounded by private homes and there is no parking. So if you want to walk Fredonia Lane, it is best to do so from the south. This is a photo looking from the south, an interesting photograph from the 1880s, courtesy of the Marist College archives. The big house is the house built by Henry Hackett, whose 1939 article in the Dutchess County Historical Society yearbook I had mentioned earlier as a source. It is today home to the Town of Hyde Park Recreation Group. Fredonia Lane is just outside of view on the left. Some speculate that the little house at the far left might be a house along Fredonia Lane. The houses of New Guinea were likely small. Archaeological work suggests that some were as small as 15 by 15 feet and were made of wood with stone cellars in some instances. There are a good many references to a side hill house, where a house, in the most rudimentary form, is built into the side of a hill. This might be done for several reasons. One is that the land is too rocky to create a full cellar. Also, less construction material is needed, and yet it's solid and secure. One can imagine, however, that light and air are greatly reduced. This is a more sophisticated version of what we're talking about. The house appears to have two walls fully built into a hill, and the remaining two sides are built in that fashion to a lesser degree. Freemanville is another similar but much smaller transient community of color just before the Civil War in Beekman and southern Dutchess. This 1877 illustration comes from a county history and uses the sarcastic comment palace. In 1818, Caesar Freeman, a free black man, bought 3 acres for $312. This was enough to be a catalyst for others to settle there, which puts the scale of New Guinea in perspective. Archaeological work done by Bard College revealed that there were a greater number of sheep teeth than teeth from pigs and cows. We know that Dr. Samuel Bard was a pioneer in the experiments with merino sheep, originating from Spain and used for fine wool. Another use was simple crop management. There was enormous pressure for farmland to increasingly become more and more productive, and William Bard published notes in 1817 saying he successfully used sheep to graze in fields left fallow as part of a crop rotation strategy. Archaeological work also shows that they smoked clay pipes and enjoyed oysters among their typical daily activities. They lived, worked, played, and died on Fredonia Lane. As was the custom at the time, a number were buried on their farmsteads and remain there today. Archaeological work can be important, especially when there is a lack of documentary evidence. But even archaeologists advise caution on disturbing land and its contents, and always approach with great care and caution. The earliest document we can find that relates to Fredonia Lane is a formal agreement between Samuel Bard and Quackenbush. It's a lease dated 1811, courtesy of Bard College archives, allowing Quackenbush 5 acres of land along the east side of Fredonia Lane. The quality of the land is marshy and rocky. This is essentially why the Crum Elbow Creek does a U-turn here. This is clearly revealed in the description of the boundary described in the lease, which says, and I quote, "beginning at a stake and a stone at a swamp near a soft maple tree." Swamps and rocks are the main feature of the terrain here. Our best guess is that they were likely raising some sort of livestock like sheep. The lease requires a payment of $8.75 annually with the option to purchase the lot anytime for $125. It's signed by Samuel Bard and Quackenbush and witnessed by Samuel Bard's sons William and neighbor Valentine Odell. In the document, Samuel Bard is described as a physician and Quackenbush as a laborer. From annual receipts on the back, we find that Mr. Quackenbush paid annual rents every year between 1811 and 1820, with the exception of 2 years. He never exercised the option to purchase. 1820 may have been the year that Quackenbush changed employment. From the Bremen diaries at FDR Library, Bremen writes that Quackenbush worked as a gardener for Judge Pendleton at Placentia, the estate just north of the Bards. from 1820 to 1830. Brayman notes he was, quote, a little man. So when we come to learn that a New Guinea resident is a gardener, the role has the potential to be something much bigger than we might imagine. For example, in a town just to the north, Alexander Gilson was black and born in 1824 on the Great River estate owned by Janet Livingston Montgomery in the town of Red Hook. Among many other things, Gilson was responsible for breeding 2 new varieties of begonia. One is formally named for him using a Latin version of his family name. I'd like to talk about Mr. Quackenbush's seemingly unusual name, but it's actually not unusual at all. It was very common among early Dutch settlers. It apparently refers to, in Dutch, to swamp or swampy woods. Apparently there are 2,500 people today in the United States who have the name Quackenbush, usually Q-U-A. The first name is not unusual either if you look to the Akhans, the dominant ethnic group in the African country of Ghana. In Akan language and naming tradition, names are specific to a particular person, perhaps how they look, or in the instance here, the day they were born. The Akan word for a boy born on a Wednesday, Kwaku, K-W-A-K-U, often anglicized as it is here, starting with a Q. You'll find quite a few Africans and African descendants with that name at that time in the country and county. St. James Sunday School records note that Quackenbush, while renting the land described, lived on Fredonia Lane just across from Phineas Martin. The first land sale by Samuel Bard to a person of color seems to be Phineas Martin, a man noted as free black as early as the 1790 census. Primus, or Prime, and his wife Elizabeth, called Betty Prime, built a house on the 4.5-acre lot after they purchased it in 1821. They are said to be buried there as well. We don't know how they earned their freedom, assuming they were once enslaved, which is very likely. In 1790, the census for the town of Clinton, which then included today's towns of Clinton, Pleasant Valley, and Hyde Park, among a white population of 1,295 and enslaved population of 113, there were only 8 free persons of color, and 4 of them were in the household of Phineas Martin. They are involved with the St. James Church, and St. James archives reveal monthly monetary gifts to Phineas Martin in the last 2 years of his life for the purchase of firewood. As I mentioned earlier, Fredonia Lane was connected to a very important east-west route, connecting a mill and a landing at the Hudson River, where farmers would trade agricultural goods processed to some degree or another, and trade them for manufactured goods in return. This exchange was the foundation of the Dutchess County, and for that matter, Hudson River Valley economy at the time. Let's look at what happened along that road, starting at the east end near the mill. In January of 1833, Richard Jenkins bought 8 acres of land on the north side of Mill Road from David DeVoe and his wife, who owned over 50 acres there. Jenkins is the only community member we have a photo of, shown here. It was published by St. James Parish in 1913. He was obviously loved by the St. James Church community. He was sexton for 35 years, from 1822 to 1857. So he had literally taken many of Hyde Park's people to their final resting place. According to church records, he was born in 1783 and baptized in the church December 20, 1829. He was an enslaved man in the Bard family. He was living in a house he shared with a white man at Bard's Rock, a northern part of Bard Estate, when David Hossick bought the 730-acre Bard Estate and removed Jenkins' house. Richard and his wife Nancy had many children. The youngest, Catherine, married Civil War veteran Bill Carl, who we'll hear more about shortly. Catherine was the last surviving family member and was resident there when the church celebrated its 100th anniversary in 1911. Richard was a paid employee of the church for decades, so he was a salaried man who owned property. His wife Nancy had paid work for the church as a laundress. The church was obviously an important part of their financial, social, and emotional safety and security. If Caesar Freeman could be a catalyst for other persons of color with the purchase of 3 acres of land, then Richard Jenkins' purchase of this property had to have been important. Richard worked as sexton at St. James until his death in 1857. His grave and headstone are easily seen today, not in a separate and segregated section as was the custom at the time. This raises the interesting matter of faith. It's interesting that in the 1830s, two AME Zion churches, African Methodist Episcopal churches, were formed in Poughkeepsie and another similar transient mixed-race community called Baxtertown in southern Dutchess, but not in Hyde Park. No doubt the depth of the relationship between St. James and the New Guinea community rendered such a need less urgent. Also, their participation in the Episcopal Church meant that on Sunday morning these persons of color, negotiating their freedom and legal status, were sitting among the most prominent residents, albeit in the upper gallery. Let's now look at a landmark toward the western boundary of New Guinea, Guinea Bridge. The most important land transaction here, I believe, the first land purchase by a person of color in the area, was in February of 1814, when Richard Teller sold 1.5 acres right at Guinea Bridge to Peter Griffin. Although seemingly small, it was strategic and created a space, although a very crude space, to support an influx of free persons of color literally in the backyard, running along Crumelbo Creek on both sides. The lot has a wide front on what is today East Market Street and goes back to the creek. While technically, legally, Griffin owned to the middle of the creek, the opposite side of the creek is a flat space for a short distance, and then there's an enormous 40-foot sheer cliff going up, such a distance that it could not easily be scaled. So the end of the backyard of Peter Griffin's lot felt more like the area on the far side of Crumelbo Creek. So when Brayman describes what must have been the most rudimentary of shacks, he later used the patronizing words, "The area has since been cleaned up on both sides of the Crumelbo." I believe he was referring to where the neediest of the New Guinea community would have taken shelter, here in the backyard of the Griffin house. We're not sure how Peter Griffin earned his freedom, but we do know how his son Griffin did. This document is accessible through Dutchess County Ancient Documents online portal. Griffin had been enslaved by Tobias L. Stoutenberg. This is the manumission document. It reads as follows, and I quote, "Know all men by these presents that I, Tobias L. Stoutenberg, in consideration of $1 and other consideration, do hereby manumit, liberate, and make free my slave, Griffin. Signed in the presence of Edmund H. Pendleton, April 4, 1821. The certifying judge, James Emmett, wrote, and I quote, "The said Griffin lives in Dutchess County. He's 31 years old, was born in Hyde Park, is about 5 feet 8 inches tall, is well set, is well looking, and has a scar in the corner of his left eye." End quote. No doubt these physical descriptions were important ways to protect Griffin by closely linking the document to his physical self. We've been looking at the northwest corner of Guinea Bridge. Let's look at the northeast corner and Solomon Garnett. You'll remember him from our description of the May 1870 festivities celebrating the adoption of the 15th Amendment. Solomon Garnett was a freedom seeker escaping enslavement in Virginia in the 1830s when he decided to stop in New Guinea, which became his home for life. The construction of Howard Boulevard obliterates the north bank of the creek where Garnett had his crude home, referred to by Brayman in his diaries as a side hill house, as we discussed earlier. Brayman reports that Old Sol, as he was called, first lived in the pine woods, just south of the U-shape of the Crumelbo Creek. This is a contemporary view showing the bridge and showing how the building of that road filled in the area. Peter Griffin's house is shown in the upper left. I'm sure with the anchor of Peter Griffin just to the west and Richard Jenkins, Prime, and Betty Martin, and Quackenbush to the east and others, Garnett felt some security in spite of the poor condition of his home. Brayman writes in his diaries that Bill Carl owned a farm he described as a good old-fashioned house of a few acres, that was located on the road that is today called Pinewoods Road, which runs from the tip of the U-shape Crum Elbow southwest to the main road below the village center, today's Route 9. There must have been a Stoutenberg forest lot there, which might have been the source of the name used to describe the area. Carl was not born in Hyde Park. He arrived prior to the Civil War. He was 37 years old when he enlisted in the 26th U.S. Colored Troops, one of 3 such troops to serve from New York State. He was wounded in one of the battles they engaged in South Carolina before mustering out in 1865. He died in 1890 and is buried in Union Cemetery with his service noted on his gravestone. He had received a pension for his service and sacrifice in the war. Before we stray further from the U-shaped center of New Guinea, I'd like to share some insights into the Stoutenberg family, which owned a significant portion of land known as the Water Lot Number 9, which was not very tall along the Hudson River, but was very deep running east into the county. They settled here, starting in 1735, where the Bards and subsequent families like Hossack owned north of Crum Elbow Creek. The Stoutenbergs owned land south of the creek. One of their homes still stands, owned by the Stoutenberg Family Association, just south and east of the area we've been discussing. Typically at the time, enslaved persons lived in the attic or cellar of the enslaving family's home, not in separate quarters like the plantation south. The earlier illustration shows that there were no dormers originally in the house, and living in the attic or basement would have lacked light and air. You're looking at a mural painted in 1940 by Olin Dowes in the Hyde Park Post Office, which was built under the exacting direction of Hyde Park's own Franklin Roosevelt, who was U.S. president at the time. The murals were designed to be an educational tool depicting the history of Hyde Park. In the booklet that was published to accompany the murals, Dowes wrote this about the scene. Before 1791, Jacobus Stoutenberg, his sons, and slaves clear the land. The scene is notable for several reasons. Simply by depicting enslaved persons and describing them as such in 1940, Dowes was progressive. In the town just north, Rhinebeck, in murals and work done at the same time, someone had the descriptor slaves stricken from the booklet, while here it remained. Dowes was a detailed student of history. He would have intentionally depicted and called out in his published writing a scene that shows an enslaved black man working alongside the slave owner's sons. The smaller population of the early settlement period meant that large tasks like the raising of a house or barn, harvesting or clearing land, would require the all-hands-on-deck participation of neighbors, both free and enslaved. Let's move to the last leg of our journey, further west of Guinea Bridge on East Market Street, which will take us to the Hyde Park Village Center. Remember hunting Cheryl, the physician friend and colleague of Dr. Bard and Dr. Hossack, the land and real estate businessman? We're looking at a map of his property at the time, the northern side of what is today called East Market Street, between the village center to the west and Guinea Bridge to the east. If you compare the map to today's Dutchess County parcel access, which shows contemporary property lines, you can see the similarities. Both sides of the street came to be home to persons of color. Here we're looking at an 1876 map with the west oriented to the top. So let's start at the bottom. Guinea Bridge is just out of sight, but we can see Peter Griffin's house that we discussed earlier. The third generation is living there in 1876. Susan is the daughter of Griffin and a widow of Charles Rico. Staying on the north side of the road, the sexton that succeeded Richard Jenkins was a tenant here with his wife in the household of Richard Metcalf, who was a carpenter born in England. Harry and Diana Anthony lived here in the years before Harry's death. He's buried in St. James Cemetery with a headstone marking his 1866 death and 1795 birth. We've not been able to learn more about Diana. Across from them, we find an interesting and earlier story. Although sold out of the family by the time this 1876 map was made, Pompey Brown, later asking to be called Dunbar Brown, was an enslaved coachman and valet for Edmund Pendleton, arriving locally around 1820. We have good information on Brown because our diarist, Edward Brayman, took a trip to New York City and visited Brown and his wife, Amy, specifically for an interview in 1878. Brayman reports that the Browns moved to New York City, where he was a carpet shaker, whitewasher, and public waiter. In 1863, they were victims of the draft riots targeting blacks. Brayman reports that Dunbar Brown came to own a good deal of property and was successful financially. If Richard Jenkins might be considered the easternmost landmark in the New Guinea community, we might consider his son, Henry Jenkins, to be the westernmost landmark. Henry Jenkins was a professional and highly regarded barber. He started his business before the Civil War and in 1866 purchased lot number 1 in Hunting Sherrill's subdivision, right at the central corners of the village of Hyde Park. He paid $1,500 and it became the location of his business and home until his death in 1883. Things get more interesting when we discover that lot number 1 is today the site of the 1940 post office, the hometown post office of U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt. FDR may not have known about the prior land ownership. FDR was not quite 2 years old when Jenkins died, but we end up with a Rubik's Cube of historical components when we consider that FDR required the post office to be in the shape and dimension of John Bard's first home. The Bards, of course, were the enslavers of Richard Jenkins, who is depicted inside on the murals. And it all sits on the site of the land and business owned by Henry Jenkins. We've not been able to find any photographs of the building, but if you make an effort looking at the northeast corner of the village, you can just see what we believe would have been the building housing the barber shop and the home of Henry and his family. Barbers were a particularly important group. Many had an important role in the abolitionist movement and in the Underground Railroad. When Frederick Douglass gave a landmark speech in 1858 to thousands of people at Poughkeepsie's College Hill, the event was kicked off by Poughkeepsie's Charles Vermong, a barber. The person chosen to preside over the regional event was William Rich of Troy, who was a barber. He was the recognized leader of the Underground Railroad in that part of the state. His obituary in the Poughkeepsie Eagle in 1881 described him as a wealthy man who gave money to build a school and a church in Troy. Another Poughkeepsie barber, Uriah Boston, was a landowner and an outspoken and frequent critic in the national abolitionist newspapers. He was an officer at abolitionist conventions. He operated a barbershop for nearly half a century. Through his business, he was able to have the means to invest in the abolitionist movement. I'd like to look at one more remarkable story. Robert St. John was an escaped slave from Brazil who had decided he'd gone far enough north. When he reached New Guinea, he spent the rest of his life in the area. His work in Brazil involved loading a small boat and taking it some distance out to a large ship that, because of its size, could not dock at shore. Sometime in the 1840s, St. John felt he could trust the captain of the larger ship enough to enlist his help, and a plan was agreed. Brayman reports the following, and I quote, "On the agreed day that they sailed from Brazil, Robert was brought to the large ship concealed in a boatload of fruit covered with a sailcloth. Once he got onto the ship, he was concealed in a closet until 3 days out at sea. Then arriving at the port of New York, he made his escape. At Hyde Park, he could initially only speak very broken English." End of quote. Brayman reports that St. John lived consecutively in 2 white households, first with Mr. Doughty, who ran a school, and then with Augustus Cowman at a house directly across from St. James Church. It was at this time that St. John became married. St. John must have been a skilled and able person because Augustus Cowman was the architect of the St. James Church that stands today, having been recently trained in England. He had an office in New York City. Olin Dow's depicts Cowman in the same scene of the St. James Church where Richard Jenkins is depicted. Here you can also see Cowman's impressive grave at St. James Cemetery behind the church. We've now looked at the community north, south, east, and west. And what can we say we've learned? I'd like to quote the late professor of African Studies, A.J. Williams Myers, who spoke about this kind of transient community, which appeared across the Hudson Valley before the Civil War. He said that such communities as these, and I quote, were steadfast in weakening the molding of a material dispossessed and dependent African by nurturing a material affluent African. Free Africans, with their land holdings in rural areas, carved out that social space for themselves and family. They created caring, nurturing, and religious communities up and down the Hudson Valley. Many of them were mixed communities of African, European, and Native American descent. End quote. Can we say that happened here? That persons of color fractured dispossession and dependency and nurtured a materially affluent African? I say yes, with a but. On the positive side, compare the two generations of Richard and Henry Jenkins. Richard Jenkins was born enslaved and would have been 7 years old in 1790, when we know that the percentage of persons of color who were enslaved in the area was 9 out of 10. By 1866, Henry Jenkins bought not just any lot, but lot number 1 at the village center, where he maintained a home and operated his successful small business, a barbershop. I do not want in any way to suggest that New Guinea was some sort of idealist paradise for all. We've been talking about a very few people, and the greater number of persons of color live precariously in terms of all the basics of life: food, shelter, clothing, work, emotional well-being, and physical well-being and health. The community did decline, and census records show that Hyde Park, by being a river town, avoided the precipitous and long decline of the inland rural parts of the county, where after the 1827 opening of the Erie Canal, many towns did not see their 1840 population level return until a century later. At the same time, it did not see the growth that cities did. A smaller population of color became more broadly distributed across some parts, but not all, of Hyde Park. While whites in the middle of the 19th century were motivated to move from rural areas to cities like Poughkeepsie or Beacon or New York City for better paying and less seasonal economic opportunities in manufacturing, persons of color had an additional, further fundamental need relating to the securing the promise of freedom just earned and working on the arduous task of ensuring its delivery. Let's look at a few persons of color who moved from rural Dutchess to cities. They and their descendants obviously had ambitious goals. Allow me to use a few examples just outside, but within a few miles of New Guinea to make the point. When Dunbar Brown died, the New York Times reported his death, describing him as an old and respected citizen, a prominent member of St. Philip's Church, the church created in 1809 in downtown Manhattan as a church dedicated to the African community. Brown was an elected vestryman at St. Philip's, shown here on Mulberry Street in downtown Manhattan, in the important years that the church was arguing to become a full member of the larger Episcopal Church. Normally, the reception of St. Philip's into the Episcopal Diocese of New York also meant that it was accepted into the full convention, a technical difference that was important because it allowed full voting and legal and leadership rights. But in this unique instance, it was not permitted, and it was not permitted until after several decades of hard fighting, among whose leaders were Dunbar Brown, which is why he was recognized by the New York Times. St. Philip's Church, named for the saint who had converted an Ethiopian to Christianity, relocated to Harlem in 1911. It was home to generations of black leaders like W.E.B. Du Bois, Langston Hughes, and Thurgood Marshall. In terms of the number of acres owned, according to the author Michael Groth, the area with the largest black ownership of farmland was the nearby town of Milan, 2 miles northeast of New Guinea, in part because it was among the poorest valued land in the county, meaning it was less expensive and more accessible. Louis Fraser was the third generation of his family to be farmers in the town, but sometime around the Civil War he moved to New York City and became a coachman to a wealthy Fifth Avenue family. Louis and his wife Ellen had 5 children. Among them was Susan Elizabeth Fraser, born in 1864. Miss Fraser graduated from Hunter College, preparing herself to be a teacher, and became the first black woman allowed to teach white students in New York City in 1892, but only after she made national headlines suing the city after they denied her a job teaching white students based on her race. At the end of World War I in 1919, as president and founder of the Women's Auxiliary of the Harlem Hellfighters, she stood at a reception to receive a personal letter and flags from former President Theodore Roosevelt at an exercise in Harlem. A sign testifying to her life achievement was posted in the church where she was active, the same St. Philip's Church that Dunbar Brown had fought so hard to be seen as legitimate, which by this time of her early death in 1924 had moved to Harlem. This is Jasper Jackson. Like Louis Fraser, he was born in Milan, where his parents came to own 141 acres of land. But the city of Poughkeepsie called to their son Jasper. I spoke with Jasper Jackson's grandson in 2018. Walter Patrice said this about his grandfather's move, and I quote, "A lot of African Americans left the farm after the proclamation. A lot of African Americans left the farm and came to Poughkeepsie like my grandfather Jasper Jackson." Jasper Jackson became very involved in the AME Zion Church, as did subsequent generations. Walter Patrice served in World War II as a lieutenant in Europe and was a successful business and social justice advocate, especially for the equal opportunity for employment of blacks in Poughkeepsie. One last example. Abram Boland moved from rural Dover to the city of Poughkeepsie in 1866, purchasing this house, which became the home for a century for the family. Very active in movements to make higher education available to blacks. His son Gaius became the first black graduate of Williams College, and his granddaughter became the first black judge in the United States after moving to New York City. What this says to me is that yes, there was a bright spark that emerged and faded in the New Guinea community. A spark that allowed persons like Henry Jenkins to break the mold of being dispossessed and dependent. But the move to cities that the spark also generated was equally important in giving the movement both a depth and scale that was necessary for the many battles to come and those that remain today.
Young brown body lies a mouldering in the grave. Young brown body lies a mouldering in the grave. His soul is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah.